Hello, my name is Rourke, and if you've ever stood in a room full of people and realized, suddenly, you were the only one who wasn't supposed to understand what was being said, then you already know a little of my story. I thought my marriage was solid. I thought keeping the peace meant keeping us together. But the day my wife and I toured a luxury oceanfront condo, something happened that shattered every illusion I still held on to. I stayed quiet, pretending I didn't understand French. She didn't know I could hear her. She didn't know I could understand every word. And in that silence, I learned the truth about what she really thought of me, what she'd been planning without me, and who she'd been planning it with. That moment didn't just break me, it changed everything. So if you want to know how a single sentence can destroy a marriage, and how a quiet man finally learned to stop being quiet, well, you'll want to hear the rest of this. Mara had been talking about this building for weeks, so when I pulled into the garage near Jacksonville Beach that afternoon, I already knew she had rehearsed every line she planned to say. The wind carried a faint smell of salt, and the late spring light bounced off the glass tower in a way that made everything look sharper than usual. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and watched her step out with the kind of purpose that didn't leave room for anyone else. Inside the lobby, the marble floors looked freshly polished. A couple walked past us in beach clothes, laughing about something private. I tried to settle my breath, keep things normal. For years I had learned to stay steady, even when I felt myself pushed into the background. Mara walked a few steps ahead, already scanning for the seller. He found us first. A tall man with a soft French accent greeted Mara like she was the one buying the entire building. She shook his hand with confidence. I reached out a moment later, but he was already turning to guide her toward the elevators. I followed behind, pretending it didn't sting. On the ride up, she asked quick questions about HOA fees, rental restrictions, things she knew I cared about too. But she never looked at me for input. It wasn't new. Our marriage had slowly turned into a structure where she took the lead and I filled whatever space was left. When we stepped out onto the 15th floor, the hallway smelled faintly of citrus, like someone had just cleaned. The seller stopped in front of a sleek black door and reached into his pocket. He pulled out 2 key tags, each with a small silver label. Before he could hand them out, Mara grabbed the one marked Owner Access. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even glance my way. The seller looked at me and handed over the tag labeled Guest Access. It was small, harmless, but it landed in my palm with a quiet weight I didn't expect. I didn't say anything. I had learned years ago that silence kept the peace. The apartment door opened onto a bright living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the ocean side, and the surf rolled in at an easy rhythm. Mara walked ahead again, commenting on the layout, the lighting, the floors. I stayed behind them, letting the view hold me steady. The seller shifted into French as they reached the kitchen. Mara didn't miss a beat. She answered him with a polished fluency I rarely heard from her at home. She nodded toward me and said, in English, "He doesn't understand. You can speak freely." She had said it casually, like someone mentioning the weather. Years ago, I taught myself French through audiobooks during long commutes. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to track a conversation. Mara always told me it was pointless, that I should focus on something more useful. So I kept it quiet, a small skill I stored away, maybe out of pride, maybe out of stubbornness. I followed them into the hallway. The condo felt too quiet for how loud my thoughts suddenly were. In the master bedroom, the seller asked a question in French that sounded lighthearted at first. Is he reliable? Mara answered without hesitation. Reliable? He barely understands money. I manage everything. The words hit me like cold water. My shoulders tightened. My breath slowed. I stared at the ocean through the window, watching the waves blur into a single sheet of color. I didn't move. I didn't turn around. I didn't let them see anything slip. But I heard every syllable. If she felt comfortable saying it here, she had said it before. To others. Maybe many times. I stood there, letting the silence hold me still, trying to understand how long I had been reduced to a role I never agreed to play. Behind me, Mara laughed at something the seller said. Her voice floated across the room like nothing had shifted. Maybe for her, nothing had. Inside my chest, something started to loosen, the way old wood creaks before it splits. I stepped closer to the window, pretending to admire the horizon, giving myself a moment to breathe before turning back toward them. My fingers pressed lightly against the glass, grounding me. If she thought I didn't understand, what else had she said when I wasn't supposed to hear? That question stayed with me as the seller moved toward the balcony. Mara followed him, still smiling, still in control of everything. I stayed behind, letting the truth settle like sand in water. I stepped closer to the window, trying to look as if I was still taking in the view. But the truth was, my focus had already shifted. Something inside me had begun to tighten, the way a rope pulls when you finally notice how close you are to the edge. I didn't say anything. I just let the moment breathe long enough to keep myself steady before turning slightly toward the hallway. I didn't say a word, but for the first time in years, I listened with my guard up. Mara's voice carried through the open space behind me, her tone warm and confident as she spoke with the seller. She sounded like someone rehearsing for a role she'd already mastered. I watched her reflection faintly in the glass. She used her hands when she talked, controlled the conversation, directed the pace. Every so often she glanced back at me, not to include me, but to check that I wasn't interrupting. I stayed a few steps away, letting them move deeper into the condo. Their conversation blended with the sound of the waves outside, but the words still reached me clearly. The seller complimented her decisiveness. She took it like someone who had been waiting to hear it. A strange heaviness settled over me again, the same weight I had felt minutes earlier. Only this time, something sharpened under it. Awareness. A sense that what I was witnessing wasn't new. It was simply the first time I was fully awake enough to see it. As they moved toward the dining area, a memory began to surface, so quietly at first that I almost tried to push it back down. I saw myself at 8 years old, standing barefoot in the kitchen of our old house in Texas. My brothers were older, louder, always the first to speak. I was the quiet one, the one told to stay out of the adults' way. When money came up, my father spoke only to them. I can still hear him telling my mother, "He's not built for serious things. Let the older boys handle it." I remember nodding, pretending it didn't bother me. I remember being praised not for what I did, but for what I didn't disrupt. I grew up believing that taking up too much space was trouble. That silence made life easier for everyone else. And walking through this condo, hearing Mara talk over me, it all blended together in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The seller paused near the kitchen island and asked about HOA fees. I stepped forward, ready to answer. Not to take over, just to participate. But before I could get a sentence out, Mara rested her hand lightly on the counter and said, "He doesn't understand those things. I'll handle it." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. Her words landed with a dull thud, exactly like the phrases I'd heard growing up. Not cruel, not loud, but certain. That certainty was always the part that cut the deepest. It told me I wasn't just being excluded. I was expected to accept it. The memory of my father's voice came back with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Don't worry about the serious things. Someone else will handle it. I stood there, and for the first time, I understood how much that sentence had shaped the man I became. It wasn't Mara alone who placed me in the background. I had stepped into that role long before I met her. The realization broke something loose inside me. A quiet, internal tear you don't hear, but you feel all the way through. Mara and the seller continued walking toward the balcony doors. I stayed behind for a moment, letting the air settle around me. My chest felt tight, but not in the way it usually did when I stayed silent to keep the peace. This tightness felt different. It felt like a boundary, finally noticing it had been crossed too many times. I stepped outside onto the balcony and let the breeze hit my face. The ocean stretched out endlessly, calm and unbothered. I rested my hands on the railing and let myself breathe, long and steady. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't blaming her. I wasn't blaming myself either. I was simply seeing the truth without softening it. If she believes I'm incapable, maybe it's because I taught her to. That thought stayed with me, unsettling but honest. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but I knew it changed something fundamental. Behind me, I heard the sliding door open. Mara's voice reached me, softer than before, but carrying the same tone she used when she didn't want to be questioned. "Just let me handle this." Her words floated out onto the balcony like a reminder of every moment I had stepped aside without thinking. But this time, something different rose in my chest. Resistance. A quiet, steady push from a place I hadn't listened to in years. I turned from the railing and walked back inside, letting the door slide shut behind me. The condo felt colder now, and not because of the air conditioning. I walked back inside, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted her to handle anything for me ever again. Walking back inside, I stayed a few steps behind Mara and the seller, letting the cool air of the condo ease the heat building under my skin. I didn't show it, but something in me had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and very different from the man who had walked in earlier. That feeling stayed with me, sharp and undeniable, as we moved toward the kitchen area with the seller. The three of us entered the open kitchen, sunlight washing over the countertops. Mara was already mid-sentence, talking with that same confidence she always carried around people she wanted to impress. The seller nodded along, polite, patient. I could tell he admired her assertiveness. A lot of people did. I stayed close enough to look engaged, but far enough to keep control of my own thoughts. I didn't want to linger on the balcony forever and let my silence become another excuse for her to speak for me. So I stepped forward and asked the seller something simple about the appliances. Nothing complex, just enough to feel present again. He started answering, explaining the upgrades and warranties when Mara cut in before he finished. "I already looked up the specs," she said, waving lightly in my direction. "I've done the research. He doesn't need to worry about all that." I didn't say anything. I watched her finish the explanation that should have been mine to hear. And there it was again. The pattern. A familiar rhythm I had lived with for years without noticing the beat. She spoke like she carried our entire life alone. She talked as if I was an accessory, not a partner. She insisted she was handling things, even when no one had asked her to prove it. And I realized, standing in that kitchen, that she had been doing this for a long time. The strange part wasn't that Mara behaved this way. The strange part was that I had let myself fade into the background for so long that she believed the background was where I belonged. As she continued explaining the appliances for the cellar, a memory flickered through my mind, clearer than it had been in years. It was during a family dinner back in Texas. My brothers were joking about money, bragging about their business wins, their smart choices. Then the conversation shifted, and someone made a jab about how I never understood finances. Everyone laughed, including Mara. She hadn't meant it to be cruel, but she still laughed, and that laugh planted itself in a place I didn't like to visit. I remember smiling, pretending it didn't bother me. But the truth is, it stayed with me, tucked away under layers of silence. Moments like that have a way of shaping how you show up in your own life, even if you don't want them to. Back in the condo, Mara joked again while the seller opened a cabinet. "He likes to think he knows numbers," she said lightly. "But trust me, he doesn't." Her words hit harder than before. Not because they were new, but because I finally understood how heavy they had grown over the years. One comment wasn't the problem. It was the 100 that came before it. The 1,000 tiny moments where I stepped aside and let other people define me. That slow realization tightened something inside my chest. I glanced around the condo, the calm blue tones, the view stretching out past the horizon, the way the light filled every corner. And strangely, I could picture a life here, not just visiting, living, breathing differently, feeling something other than small. It was the first time the idea came to me. What if the problem isn't me? What if it's the way I let myself be treated? The thought stayed with me as we moved back toward the living room. I looked down at the key tag still resting in my hand. Guest access, a harmless label at first glance, but it carried the weight of every time I'd taken the smaller role without question. That tag wasn't just for the door. It was the role I'd accepted in my marriage, in my family, in my own sense of worth. The clarity hit like stepping into cold water. A shock, a jolt, but also a wake-up call I couldn't ignore. Mara and the seller walked back to the dining area, where a stack of papers lay neatly arranged. The seller handed Mara a preliminary offer sheet. She took a pen from her purse and signed her name on the primary buyer line without hesitating, without looking at me, without asking if I agreed. I watched her sign, and that small act carried the full weight of everything I had felt since we walked into this condo. A tightening formed in my chest. Not panic, not fear. Something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Resistance. I wondered quietly but honestly, what would happen if I told her no? The tightness in my chest didn't ease as Mara signed her name. If anything, it tightened further, and I followed them slowly toward the dining table where the seller had laid out more paperwork. I stayed close enough to see every line she scribbled, yet far enough to keep my thoughts private. The seller noticed my expression before Mara did, and that small detail changed everything. He paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing with a kind of quiet awareness. He had been warm and professional since we arrived, but this time his gaze held something else, a question, maybe even concern. He shifted the pace of the tour without saying so, slowing down just enough that I could step in if I wanted. For the first time all afternoon, someone in the room seemed to recognize that I existed beyond the silent corner Mara kept pushing me toward. I cleared my throat lightly and asked about long-term maintenance fees. Nothing bold, Nothing challenging. Just a normal question any potential buyer might ask. The seller turned toward me and answered with respect, explaining the billing schedule and reserve fund. He didn't rush. He didn't speak down to me. He treated the question like it mattered. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did, but it did. Before he finished, Mara stepped in sharply. "He doesn't need to worry about that," she said, louder than necessary. "I already checked everything." The air in the condo tightened. The seller glanced at her, just a flicker, but enough to show he sensed something off. Mara forced a smile, smoothing her tone. I could tell she didn't like that someone else had opened a space where I could speak. We walked a few steps toward the living area, and the seller kept his attention subtly angled toward me. Then he asked, "What do you think about the layout?" He didn't ask Mara. He asked me. It caught me off guard, and I saw Mara's shoulders stiffen. She smiled again, but it was thinner this time, the kind of smile people use when they feel their control slipping. I answered slowly, choosing my words with care. "The space feels open. I like that the kitchen isn't boxed in." The seller nodded, listening. He reached for the contract folder on the table and handed it to me. Not Mara, me. Her expression held for half a second before it tightened, just enough for me to see it. That brief moment felt like someone had finally turned on the lights in a dim room I'd been standing in for years. I received the folder, feeling the weight of it more than any physical object I'd held that day. Mara stepped forward immediately, sliding between us. "I'll handle all the paperwork," she said, and took the folder out of my hands before I could even respond. Her voice wasn't casual anymore. It had an edge to it, a need to regain control. The seller hesitated. He looked at her, then at me, and he spoke carefully. "Would you like to review the contract yourself, sir?" I opened my mouth slightly, but Mara answered before I could breathe. "He doesn't understand these things," she said. "He never has." The words hit me with force, harder than anything she'd said before. Not because they were new, but because now I wasn't numb. I was awake, and hearing them awake made all the difference. I froze, not out of fear this time, out of shock at how easily she said it, how confidently she believed it. Every memory from my family, every dismissive comment from my brothers, every quiet moment where I let myself shrink, all of it came rushing back and settled like a stone in my stomach. She didn't want to protect me. She wanted to keep the power she'd grown used to. The seller's eyes drifted back toward me, waiting. That look alone told me he had seen enough to understand something wasn't right. I didn't grab the folder. I didn't challenge her. Not yet. But inside, something was already shifting. No more. That thought settled in me, heavy and calm. I wasn't ready to speak, but I was no longer the quiet shadow she counted on me to be. The seller cleared his throat softly. "Would you like to review the numbers yourself, sir?" I met his eyes, and even I didn't know what would come out next. I opened my mouth, and even I didn't know what would come out next. The room felt still for a moment, almost like the air had paused with me. I could hear the distant roll of waves outside the glass doors, steady and calm, in complete contrast to the pressure building inside my chest. The words felt heavy on my tongue as I finally spoke up for myself. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'd like to look at the numbers myself." The seller nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. He reached for a printed breakdown and placed it directly into my hands. He didn't look at Mara first. He didn't ask for permission. He handed it to me. Mara froze. Not visibly to anyone who didn't know her, but I saw it. Her shoulders drew in, and her eyes flicked toward me like she had missed a step on the stairs. I held the paper with both hands, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't just numbers. It was the first thing that had been handed to me in this entire process. The first thing I'd been allowed to hold without her intercepting. "Honey, you don't need to stress over this," she said softly, but her voice was too tight. The words didn't match the expression she was trying to force. She smiled, but the corners of her mouth shook. The seller stayed quiet, observing. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper, grounding myself. I cleared my throat and asked the seller about square footage, then moved to HOA dues. My voice wavered a little at first, but I steadied it. The seller answered each question directly, looking at me, not at her. I stumbled once over a term on the page, and Mara jumped in immediately. "See? This is why I handle things like this. These forms are confusing for him." Her tone wasn't gentle anymore. It had sharpened. I took a step back, creating a little space between us. "I'm fine," I said quietly. She heard the firmness. She didn't like it. I kept reading. The longer I held that paper, the more it felt like a small act of defiance. Not loud, not dramatic, just mine. I gestured toward the balcony. "I want to walk through these numbers by myself for a minute." That one sentence changed the air in the condo. Mara followed me immediately, her footsteps quick behind mine. "Why are you doing this here?" she whispered, her voice low, tight. "Can we not make a scene?" A scene. That's what she cared about. Not my voice, not my involvement, just her image, her control. The condo was quiet as I stepped toward the window. The orange light of late afternoon was starting to soften, slipping toward early evening. I held the paper close, taking a slow breath. She came closer and lowered her voice. "You know numbers wear you out. Let me handle it." I turned to face her fully, and in that moment, I finally saw it clearly. She wasn't helping me. She was keeping the reins. She needed me to stay quiet, small, out of the way. The seller walked toward us again, perhaps sensing things had shifted too far. "If either of you need help understanding the breakdown, I can walk you through it," he offered gently. I opened my mouth to answer, but Mara stepped in front of me, blocking part of my view. "He always overthinks and gets confused," she said, loud enough for the room. "Just give me the papers." That hit differently. It landed harder than any comment she'd made before. Maybe because she said it in front of someone else. Maybe because she didn't even hesitate. I stood still for a long moment. I felt something inside me pull tight, slow and painful, like an old wound being touched directly. All the quiet moments in our marriage, all the small comments I brushed aside, all the times I told myself to keep the peace, they stacked up in my chest until they felt like they were pressing against my ribs. I saw my entire role in our marriage with uncomfortable clarity. I stepped back slightly. I held the papers close, pressing them against my chest with both hands. "No," I said quietly. "I'm reading this." My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her eyes widened, then narrowed sharply. It was the first time I'd ever seen real alarm flash across her face, like something she'd always taken for granted had suddenly slipped from her grip. She leaned closer and whispered through clenched teeth, "What has gotten into you?" I exhaled once, slow and steady, feeling my resolve settle like a stone on solid ground. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't back down. That quiet defiance settled in my chest as if it had been waiting there for years, just waiting for me to stop swallowing my voice. The condo lights had shifted warmer as the sun lowered outside, stretching long reflections across the floor. It made everything feel sharper, more exposed. Her eyes narrowed as if she realized she was losing something she never thought she'd have to fight for. She stepped closer, her tone lowered but sharp enough to cut. "Stop this. You're embarrassing both of us." But her voice wasn't steady. I caught the faint tremor, the one she tried to hide behind confidence. It wasn't anger alone. It was fear. Fear that my silence wasn't guaranteed anymore. I kept the folder tucked under my arm. "I'm reading the paperwork," I said. My tone wasn't confrontational. It was simply final. Mara's jaw tightened. She reached out quickly and pulled the packet from my hand. Not a gentle tug. She took it like she was reclaiming something that belonged to her. "You're making this complicated for no reason," she snapped. The seller stood a few feet away, his posture still, his attention drifting between us even though he pretended to study the lighting controls. He wasn't fooling anyone. He saw the shift happening, whether Mara wanted to admit it or not. I swallowed slowly, keeping my calm. "I need to look at it," I said. "That's all." She didn't respond to me. Instead, she pivoted toward the seller and said, "Ignore him. I'll sign everything." That sentence wasn't coded in charm or diplomacy. It was rigid, possessive. It stung harder than I expected because it was the first time she didn't even pretend I was part of the decision. Something inside me twisted. For years, I convinced myself she spoke over me because she was trying to help, trying to keep things steady. But now, seeing her talk about me like I wasn't even in the room, I realized she wasn't protecting me. She was protecting her power. I reached out and took the packet back. Not roughly, just firmly enough to make her blink in surprise. She looked at my hand, as if she couldn't believe I'd actually taken it. The seller eased back a half step, giving me space, maybe even silently approving. "I'm the buyer too," I said, meeting Mara's eyes with a steady gaze. "I have every right to read this." That was the first boundary I'd ever spoken to her without softening the edges. She opened her mouth to fire back, but I lifted a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to signal that I was still speaking. For the first time in our marriage, she didn't interrupt. "If we're making a decision this big," I continued, "I'm going to understand it." She stared at me, stunned. Her expression flickered through disbelief, irritation, and something almost like panic. Then her voice rose, sharp and loud. "Why are you acting like this? This isn't you." I held her stare. Maybe that's the problem. The seller busied himself opening a cabinet door, giving us a moment of privacy while still listening. Anyone would. The tension was thick enough to notice from across the room. Mara took a step back, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. She looked like she was trying to gather her arguments, but didn't know which one would still work on me. I walked to the kitchen island and pulled out one of the tall stools. The seat was cool under my hand as I sat down, spreading the papers in front of me. I flipped through the contracts slowly, page by page, taking my time to absorb every detail. The numbers weren't complicated. I could understand them fine. I realized how long I'd allowed myself to believe I couldn't. Mara stayed standing. She didn't know where to put herself now. The seller approached quietly after a moment, respectful but purposeful. "If you'd like to see the master suite alone," he said, "it might help you think." I closed the folder. The weight of the decision, of everything leading up to this moment sat heavy but clear. I nodded, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. I closed the folder and nodded, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. That thought followed me as I stepped into the master suite. The door eased shut behind me, and for the first time since we arrived, the noise in my head finally settled. The master suite was quiet, and for the first time that afternoon, I could finally think. I walked toward the wide windows, watching the ocean stretch out under the fading evening light. The water moved in steady rolls, calm and unconcerned with anything happening behind me. I let the silence settle, breathing slowly until my heartbeat evened out. A moment earlier, something in me had shifted, cleanly. I wasn't the same man who walked into this condo, and I could feel that difference settling into my bones. It wasn't anger driving me, it was clarity. I barely had time to take another breath before the door opened. Mara slipped inside and closed it firmly behind her. Her shoulders were stiff, her breathing too controlled. I'd known her long enough to recognize when she was preparing for a performance. She kept her voice soft, almost trembling. "What's going on with you? You're scaring me." This was the tone she used whenever she wanted to pull me back into the familiar place. Quiet, compliant, grateful for her guidance. I'd fallen for it many times before. I sat on the bench at the foot of the bed, folding my hands and letting silence speak for me. My lack of reaction rattled her more than any argument could. She moved closer. "You never handle these things. I've always been the one carrying the responsibility. If I seem controlling, it's because you never step up." She shook her head as if she were the one being mistreated. "You don't know what it's like to manage everything alone." The words were meant to confuse me, make me doubt myself. She'd used this tactic throughout our marriage, turning her dominance into a burden she heroically bore. I kept my eyes on the floor, letting her speak. That unsettled her even more. Her voice sharpened. "And if you ruin this deal, I swear you'll regret it." There it was, the truth behind all the softness. I stood and walked toward the dresser where the seller had placed a supplemental stack of documents earlier. I opened the folder, flipping through the pages slowly. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, just giving my mind space to clear. And then something caught my eye. A form labeled Co-Buyer Representative Authorization. I frowned. I hadn't agreed to anything like that. My name wasn't on the designated line, but Mara's was. I turned the page, reading more carefully. A clause near the bottom hit me like a jolt. Primary decision-making authority shall be granted exclusively to the representative listed above. If this contract went through unchanged, she would have full legal control over the unit. I would have none. My stomach tightened. She hadn't just dismissed me in conversation. She had tried to erase me entirely from a decision we were supposed to be making together. I held up the paper and turned to her. "You were signing this without telling me." She froze. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, the truth flashing through before she tried to cover it. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "You were going to go along with it. You always do." That sentence hit harder than any insult spoken today. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. That's how she saw me. Someone who would always yield, no matter the cost. Something inside me broke, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't collapse. It was awakening. I folded the document slowly and stepped closer. "This isn't about the condo," I said softly. It's about control, and you know it." She didn't deny it. Her silence said more than her words ever could. I sat back down on the bench, placing the document beside me. "We're not leaving this room until you tell me why you did this." Her lips parted, and for a moment, she didn't look angry. She looked cornered. What came out next was nothing I expected. The sound barely carried, fragile as a loose thread. I held still, waiting, and she finally let the name slip. She whispered a name, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Julian. It didn't hit like a shout. It landed like a slow drop of ice down my spine. I knew the name. She'd mentioned him once or twice in passing, always brushing it off. Someone from her workplace. Someone she said was barely an acquaintance. Someone insignificant. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "What does he have to do with this contract?" She didn't answer right away. She pressed a hand to her forehead and started pacing, her steps tight and uneven. The soft glow of the bedroom lamps picked up the tremor in her shoulders. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "Julian said the seller wanted a buyer who could make decisions fast. Someone who wouldn't hesitate." Her voice cracked. "He told me it would be easier if everything went under my name." A long breath escaped me, slow and controlled. "So you replaced me." She didn't deny it. Her silence dragged across the room like a heavy chain. I stepped back and braced myself against the dresser. I needed the support more than I wanted to admit. The truth wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. When she finally spoke, her words shook. "Julian thought it was the only way we'd qualify without delays. He said you always second-guess everything. I agreed." The sting came fast, not because she trusted someone else more than me, but because she had done it behind my back, assuming I'd accept it quietly. My legs grew weak, and I sat on the corner of the bed, staring down at my hands. All the moments over the years flooded back. Times she laughed off my questions. Times she made choices without including me. Times I stepped back to keep the peace. And now this. I stood again, forcing myself to breathe in a controlled rhythm. "You made a decision that affects both of us, and you did it without me." She snapped her head toward me. The softness vanished. "If you acted like a husband, I wouldn't have to." The words hit their target, designed to wound, but instead of shrinking, I felt something inside me settle into place. A stillness that wasn't resignation. It was understanding. I walked back to the dresser where the contract pages lay, spread out in a messy fan. I sifted through them again, slower this time. I wasn't looking for confirmation anymore. I was looking for motive. Then I saw it. The authorization page. Her signature filled the line where both of ours should have been. The clause underneath in bold text declared she would have full decision-making authority. No shared votes. No required consent. This condo wasn't about a home. It was about power. I pulled the page free and held it up. "You were going to submit this without telling me." Her face went pale, then flushed with anger and fear. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "You were going to agree anyway. You always do." There it was, the truth behind every small dismissal, every assumption. She never expected me to question anything, and she relied on that. I folded the page slowly, clean edges lining up. The sound of the paper creasing echoed faintly. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice pitching up. I slipped the folded sheet into my pocket. "This is a joint purchase," I said quietly. If one partner is erased, the contract dies. You erased me. Now I'm ending it. Her mouth opened, but the words tangled. She stepped toward me, desperate. You can't walk out. I already told Julian. I turned sharply. Julian doesn't decide my life, and he doesn't sign for my home. She stopped moving. The shock in her eyes wasn't about me walking away from the deal. It was about me walking away from the role she needed me to play. I opened the bedroom door and walked back into the living room. The seller looked up from his tablet, sensing the tension even before I spoke. I placed the folder on the counter. We're not moving forward, I said with finality. He nodded slowly, professional enough not to pry. Behind me, I heard Mara's breath falter, then steady into something colder. You're making a mistake you'll never come back from, she said. I turned around slowly, feeling something shift in the air around us. She wasn't threatening the purchase. She was threatening me. He turned around slowly, realizing she wasn't threatening the deal. She was threatening me. That truth settled over my skin like a cold wave. She stood near the kitchen counter, her arms rigid at her sides, but her face told the real story. Fear, not of losing a condo, of losing control. Her face was pale, but her eyes held something I hadn't seen in years. Fear of losing control. I didn't move. I didn't speak. For the first time in a very long while, I didn't rush to calm the moment, smooth it over, or explain myself. I let the silence stretch. It was her turn to fill it. She stepped closer, her voice clipped. You walk away from this, and Julian will make sure your career stalls. You'll lose everything. The way she said it, steady, practiced, told me she'd rehearsed that threat. It wasn't emotional, it was tactical. She wasn't scared of us falling apart. She was scared of losing her grip on the version of me she depended on. I absorbed every word, not with panic, but with a strange sense of clarity, because for the first time, I understood exactly what she valued. And it wasn't partnership. It wasn't respect. It was leverage. I drew in a slow breath. How long have you and Julian been planning this? The room went silent. The lights hummed faintly overhead. The ocean outside the windows moved in slow, dark sheets. She didn't look at me. Her eyes flickered toward the floor, then the wall, then back to the seller's forgotten paperwork. It started as advice, she whispered. Then it became easier to listen to him than fight with you. That wasn't an apology. It was an admission. My stomach tightened, but I didn't raise my voice. So you partnered with a stranger to manage your own husband. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Like if she didn't see me, the truth would hurt less. It wasn't like that, she murmured. It was exactly like that, I said. The words weren't loud. They were final. I walked a few steps closer, slow, steady. Years of swallowed arguments and quiet sacrifices pressed behind my ribs, but they didn't explode. They crystallized. They clarified. I loved you enough to stay quiet, I said. But quiet doesn't mean weak, and it sure doesn't mean blind. Her breath hitched. She wasn't trembling because of anger anymore. She was trembling because she realized I had stepped outside her script, and she had no idea what came next. I turned to the seller. He'd been standing respectfully near the counter, trying to look busy, but not quite succeeding. We're withdrawing our offer completely, I told him. He stiffened, nodded once. Of course, sir. No argument, no surprise. He'd seen enough during the tour to understand exactly what was happening. Behind me, Mara's voice cracked. You can't do this. We're supposed to build a future. We just hit a rough patch. Her tone was frantic, all the careful calculation gone. She sounded like someone watching her version of our marriage crumble. "I didn't hit a patch," I said quietly. "You did. I just kept walking." Her mouth parted in disbelief, like the idea of me seeing her actions clearly was somehow the greatest betrayal. I walked to the chair where I'd left my jacket earlier. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of everything, not the fabric, but the years. Years of being talked over, corrected, maneuvered. Years of thinking peace mattered more than my own voice. Not anymore. Not tonight. She stepped forward, panic rising. "What am I supposed to tell Julian?" I didn't turn around. "Tell him you finally met someone who told you no." Her breath caught. That sentence was a boundary she couldn't move, twist, or negotiate. I looked toward the windows for one last moment. The ocean stretched out wide and open, untouched by all the small battles happening behind me. It looked like freedom. Steady, patient, waiting. I walked toward the hallway, the condo suddenly feeling much larger and much quieter. As I reached the entrance, I allowed myself one final look back. Not longing, not regret. Just acknowledgement of what I had finally understood. Silence can protect you, but it can also bury you. And today, I chose to rise. I stepped into the hall and pressed the elevator button. The folded contract page was still in my pocket, the edges warm from my hand. Not a trophy, not proof, just a reminder of the day I stopped letting someone else speak for me.